Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be continuing our look at the West and moving west and talking today about a concept called manifest destiny, which is essential and crucial to understanding westward expansion in this period. And we'll be using this word manifest destiny a lot here. And then we're going to see this come back also after the Civil War when we see the United States expanding actually beyond the North American continent. We will once again see this concept of manifest destiny. It's very much becomes a part of the narrative and American identity, and it is absolutely crucial to understanding a lot of the expansion west into this period. Now, once again, now we're in a point where we're looking at what we probably a lot of us have in our minds when we think about the West and we think about some of those oftentimes stereotypical, but there is a great deal of truth to some of those images when we think about the Wild West or things along those lines. The West, of course, and westward expansion, this isn't a new concept. The West, whether you're talking about the West as in California or the West is in, Western Pennsylvania or Ohio, the West has always been this place of almost magical allure. It's always been a powerful magnet for those who are dreaming of a better life, those dreaming of freedom, of self-fulfillment, of economic prosperity. And by 1860, which is the year in which the Civil War eventually begins, millions of people, probably somewhere around 43 million people, had settled the West. So there is a massive amount of westward expansion that takes place in this period. Just really the amount of expansion, territorial expansion, that the United States experiences in this time, looking at from the Revolution in 1776 until the Civil War, is really quite massive. We see, it go from in the Revolution, 13 little bitty colonies to by within someone's lifetime. It's completely conceivable that someone born in the time of the Revolution, the United States isn't even a country, 13 little colonies fighting for their independence. If that person lives a reasonably full life, by the time they die, the United States expands all the way to the Pacific Ocean. California is a state. Texas is a state. There's just a massive amount of expansion that takes place during this time. So we want to take a look at some of the various factors, and some of them we know they're obvious: farming, mining, that kind of thing. But let's look at the overall understanding of why Americans maybe felt that it was important to expand west, and also what is fueling this massive expansion once we get certainly to the 1840s and into the 1850s. And that is this concept of manifest destiny. Hugely important concept when it comes to expansion, both here and after the Civil War as well. Destiny, of course, means, something you're meant for, something you are bound for, something that is like almost foretold or understood to be written as a part of your future. Manifest destiny was this belief that really had already been believed in prior to the 1840s, but it becomes defined, it starts being called manifest destiny by the 1840s. It is this idea that it was God's will, that God intended for Americans to expand west, for Americans to eventually take more territory and eventually to possess the entire continent, from sea to shining sea, as we say, from Atlantic to Pacific, that this was the destiny or the ultimate future for the United States, and that this is what God intended, that Americans were sort of God's chosen people, meant to spread out, meant to acquire land, and with it, spreading American ideals like democracy and spreading Christianity and all of those things, and spreading all that superior Americanness and all over the continent, and bringing that salvation, as it were, to the rest of the continent. And so manifest destiny, which kind of comes out of the War of 1812, the whole Americans are divine, Americans are somehow special, a unique example, sort of God's chosen people. But then the word manifest destiny comes along a little bit later. But it is this belief in manifest destiny that some people feel very, very passionate about. And it is largely this belief in manifest destiny that's going to be fueling a lot of the expansion into this period, whether you're talking about expansion into Texas, expansion into Oregon, expansion into California. A lot of that is done on this belief of manifest destiny, that this is what Americans Americans are destined for. We are entitled to it. It should be ours. And it's just it sums up a really aggressive, spirit of territorial expansion. And it adds a moral justification for it, to say this is not just greediness, it's not just land grabbing and hogging all the land and wanting to rule over everybody, that there is some kind of almost divine or even religious kind of purpose to this. So manifest destiny is one of the things that is used, or it's a reason why some people supported territorial expansion, but it's also used to justify that territorial expansion, to make it seem right and okay, like it was just part of the mission and part of the plan. Now, one thing, of course, that all this expansion and that manifest destiny definitely ignores the prior claims of people to those very lands that Americans are going to be expanding into and claiming. The claims of Native Americans, the claims of Hispanic people. So naturally, this isn't going to be just simple and easy. This is, of course, going to bring conflict. So this does bring about conflict, of course, with many different groups of people, especially Native Americans. This land that we're talking about, if we're talking about California, whatever, or all the land in between, that is land that is already inhabited by Native Americans. It is already inhabited by a number of people. In all of this great American West, there's probably, there are more than 300,000 or so Native Americans that have called that home, some of which for centuries. And so as Americans are moving out west, as the wagon trains and the pioneers and all of those things were coming through, that of course leads to conflicts. And so there's a number of, both major and minor fights, scraps, battles, incidences, and some of these things eventually evolving into full-fledged wars with Native Americans. And so to try to calm down this tension and avoid future wars with Native Americans, avoid a full-out war for the United States against Native Americans in these particular regions, and to try to secure American expansion, to have peace with Native Americans, with not at the expense, though, of stopping expansion, to make sure we can still expand west. A treaty is negotiated with Native American tribes in 1851 called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And then there's going to be subsequent additions and revisions to this treaty throughout the 19th century. So this is kind of the first time, and then there's sort of multiple add-ons as you go through the 19th century. So there was a big conference at Fort Laramie, which is in what is today Wyoming. Thousands of Native Americans attended, probably about 10,000 or so, even some of those from tribes and from nations that were at war with each other. They all convened together with American government officials to try to work out some kind of an agreement to bring peace, so we won't have any fighting, so the Native Americans can get some of what they want, which is their land, and the understanding that their land is theirs, and control over their land, sovereignty over their land, and the United States hoping to gain not only peace, but the ability to continue moving west and to not have Native Americans get in the way of that. So the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States government basically promises, actually you can see this map here right above my head. Let me point to it. You can see the modern day, here's the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, there's my mouse, Montana and Wyoming and so forth. So all this land is set aside here for Native Americans. And basically the United States agrees in the Treaty of Fort Laramie that that land right there, belongs to Native Americans. It is theirs. They have sovereignty over it. They have control over it, all those sorts of things. However, they do have to allow the Native Americans there agree to allow passage through those lands. So as the wagon trains, as the pioneers are coming across, they have permission to travel through this land. They will not be supposedly bothered by Native Americans. So they get safe passage. We promise this land is yours forever and always. You have control of it, but we get to pass through it as we please without any kind of repercussions. It also, Native Americans have to agree to allow the United States to build roads, to build forts and things like that that would be necessary for that travel. They have to allow that. And the United States government also agrees to pay for damages, because as these wagon trains and things are going to move through this land, it could damage the land, it could damage crops or different things like that. So they're supposed to pay for any damage that's brought, that the wagon trains might bring to their hunting grounds and things like that. Again, Native Americans are supposed to stop harassing the caravans, allow the building of federal forts, all that kind of stuff. But they do have to stay within these boundaries that you see here. The importance of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, a few things. One, this does bring about a temporary peace. It does temporarily calm things down so that Americans can expand west like they want, and Native Americans can enjoy sovereignty and control over their land like they want. So it does kind of provide peace for that short amount of time. But as you can probably guess, it's not going to be permanent. It's not going to be a permanent peace, because eventually the land that we see there in that dark yellow or gold that is set aside as Native American territory, eventually white American settlers are going to want some of that as well. Eventually this agreement won't be held up and it won't be sufficient. Furthermore, this foreshadows the whole concept of reservations. A couple people have asked about, where are they putting Native Americans on reservations, where they have like a small piece of land that is assigned to that Native American tribe and they have to stay there. The answer is, in this time, no, they didn't have reservations as they will eventually come to be known. But this is like a precursor to it, by sort of setting aside these boundaries and saying, okay, this is yours and you can do what you want as long as you stay here. And you can have control as long as you stay in this little bitty space. It's not that little, but you are talking about thousands of Native Americans and lots of different groups there. This is kind of a precursor to that. The United States won't really start using the reservation system as we think of it until after the Civil War, or really kind of during, but this is kind of foreshadows that. So it's kind of one of the first movements in that direction of confining Native Americans to reservations. So it does bring about a little bit of a peace, but it is a peace that will not last, and we will eventually see that trust and those things broken, and the Treaty of Fort Laramie eventually added on to try to deal with some of that. But we're getting to more and more conflict with Native Americans in this region. Now, let's take a look then at some of the reasons why people are moving west and some of the different trails west. Again, this is the time of the iconic images that we see of the pioneers moving out west on, in the covered wagons a lot of the time, things like that. So we're going to talk about some of the different trails west, which will also help us to understand some of the different motivations for people moving out west. And some of these are going to be a bit more familiar to you perhaps than others. The first one we're going to mention is the Santa Fe Trail, which obviously leads to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is right there. So this one right here is the Santa Fe Trail. Most of these, almost all of these, you will notice start in Missouri, usually around St. Louis. That is why, going off on a little tangent for a second, in the town of St. Louis, Missouri, some of you may have been, but you may be familiar with, they have that giant arch thing that you can visit, big tourist attraction, this big giant arch. That is meant to represent the gateway to the West, because when all this is happening, St. Louis, Missouri was probably about the westernmost really populated and connected, if you will, city in the United States. So that was like the jumping off point. People that went west, that was kind of their last, the last stop at civilization before you were out in the middle of nothing until you got to your destination. So that's why most of them start right around there. Okay, so the Santa Fe Trail right here, going across what we now know as Kansas, eventually into Santa Fe, what eventually becomes Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, at the time, that was Mexico when all this is happening. Mexico had, been a colony of Spain. It becomes independent in 1820, as a lot of your Latin American nations did, and that increased a lot of economic interest. The trade opportunity was the big thing here. The thing that was bringing people to Santa Fe was mostly trade opportunities. The new government, when Mexico becomes independent, Mexico was far more interested in trading with the United States than the Spanish had been. And so, in fact, they actually wasn't even allowed in some places when Spain was in control. And so this is mostly for commerce. It's mostly for trade. It's mostly for profits. It is not so much a trail for settlement. And most of the people are traveling this trail are doing so to do business. They're going down to Santa Fe to conduct trade in silver and knives and different things, and then come back with their profits. So it's more about commerce and trade, but it does lead to economic expansion and leads to strong economic ties with that part of the country as well. We also have the Mormon Trail. We shouldn't forget that religion does play a bit of a role in westward expansion as well. The Mormon Trail, this one here in the green, again, starting in this case from sometimes in Nauvoo, or what's called Nauvoo, Iowa, or actually that's Illinois, I'm sorry, out this way, over and down, and into Salt Lake City. And this one also shows it actually going to California as well. But Salt Lake City would have been the destination for many of the Mormons taking this journey. In chapter 8, you should have read about the Mormon religion. That was a product of the Second Great Awakening, the church started by Joseph Smith, that, a whole new religious denomination that often faces significant persecution for a number of reasons. Their secrecy, their kind of seeming strange rituals, sort of a sense of self righteousness, but probably the thing that gets them in trouble the most, as well as their not lawlessness, but their sort of refusal to acknowledge and refusal to obey local laws a lot of the time. Again, not to say they're a bunch of anarchists, but they refuse to acknowledge like the authority of local law. But the thing that probably gets them in the most trouble, and I bet the thing you're thinking, is their belief and practice of polygamy, or their belief and practice of having more than one wife. That is what gets them into the most trouble. And so the Mormons kind of travel around the first handful of decades, and they're always getting run out of town or harassed or whatever. Eventually, that results in their leader, Joseph Smith, being killed. The new leader emerges, Brigham Young, who some of you will recognize as the namesake of Brigham Young University, or BYU, which is in, by the way, Utah, who then decides, or under his leadership says, we're not going to be accepted. We can't create our perfect community the way that we want to in Illinois or anywhere else. The best thing for us to do is going to be to go west and search for the promised land, as it were, a very religiously based pilgrimage. And so the Mormon Trail are the thousands of Mormons over many years moving out west and establishing Salt Lake City, and establishing, um, you know, uh, important settlements there, and eventually that becoming a very large city as it is today, with still a very, very high Mormon population. So the Mormons contribute not only to the religious fabric of the United States, but also to westward expansion. And the one that's probably the most familiar to a lot of folks is the Oregon Trail. And in my day, people my age, which we won't say what that is, but not that I'm ashamed of it, but you talk about the Oregon Trail to anybody my age, and they go, "Oh yes, that was our favorite thing to do on the computer." When I was, in middle and high school, there was a computer game called the Oregon Trail. Some of you may have played it. You can still play it online. They make online versions of it today. This was a computer game, one of the only ones we were allowed to play in school, where you simulated going west on the Oregon Trail, and you had to make all the right decisions and pack all the right supplies and avoid getting diseases and things like that to see if you could make it on the Oregon Trail. But Oregon, out this way, of course, and you can see right there. Many of these trails, kind of coincide together, and they split off here and there, like the Oregon Trail does. So it eventually, we have Oregon and California. I didn't put the California Trail on here, but that's another one. And eventually this way out to the Oregon Territory. By the 1840s, Americans really have what sometimes was called Oregon fever. There was a mass migration out to the Oregon Territory because of its fertile farmland, good climate, great weather, just seemed as a really, really good opportunity. And this is probably where, when we get that iconic image of the family with the covered wagon, a whole wagon train of multiple families moving out west, the pioneers, that really probably to me more speaks to the Oregon Trail than it does anything else. Family groups and all of that, the covered wagons and so forth. The Oregon Trail, overall, this journey would take about 6 months, depending on the weather. You had to time it just right so you didn't get stuck by the snow, and that you'd be over the Rockies by a certain amount of time. It could be very, very grueling. Native Americans, there were some attacks and some issues, but for the most part, it was peaceful. And people came from all over. People settling Oregon came from all parts of the country. They were not necessarily, this was an expensive trip to make, so they weren't necessarily America's poor, but they were definitely people looking for a better life and for opportunities, particularly in regard to farming and trade and things like that. Now, I didn't put it up there, but California is another location. Some of you know California will later be, a site of gold discovery. That doesn't happen until 1849, but before that, even ranching and livestock herding and things like that, as well as trade. Were attracting people to California as well, as early as the 1820s, and later we'll get into the gold rush thing. So now let's take a look at that Oregon Territory specifically. So the Oregon fever thing. Oregon, which let me go back for just 2 seconds. Oregon, which the Oregon country, the Oregon Territory would include what we today know of as Oregon, as well as Washington state. This for a long time was disputed. It was claimed by several different countries. That was claimed by Britain. It was claimed by Russia. It was claimed by Spain and I think somebody else. But anyway, there were several different countries that at one time had claimed it. Eventually, the Russians give up their claim and all that. And eventually, it is just the United States and Britain. So there was a treaty between the United States and Britain in 1818 that we just call the Treaty of 1818. The Treaty of 1818 was the United States and Britain agreeing to a joint occupation of Oregon. So that means that we both get to be there. We both get to live there. We both get to settle there. And we will sort of kick down the road this question of whose exactly is whose and where exactly boundaries are and all that kind of stuff for a little bit later. And for a while, that worked relatively well because you didn't have a whole lot of people in Oregon. There were some, a few missionaries, a few traders, fur trade, fishing settlements, things like that. But there wasn't like a big mass migration by either American or British American settlers to Oregon. So that joint occupation worked relatively well for a while. However, by the 1840s, that is no longer the case because the United States gets Oregon fever, as I was just talking about. There start to be, first it started with missionaries that went out to Oregon to Christianize Native Americans. And then when they all write home or come back, they have all this news of this beautiful territory and the farmland is great and the climate is mild and the Native Americans are friendly. And so that triggers this huge interest in Oregon. So now we get the Oregon Trail and more Americans are moving out to Oregon to where soon American settlers in Oregon far, far, far outnumber any British settlers. And it is apparent that, statehood is eventually where this is going. And so the joint occupation is no longer sufficient and a more formal agreement has got to be made about exactly what of this belongs to the United States and exactly what of this belongs to Britain. And by this time also manifest destiny has kicked in. And so there were many over this Oregon dispute. The dispute is over, exactly who's going to get what in regard to Oregon, dispute with Britain. And there were many people, the Manifest Destiny folks, who want as much as they can get. There was a slogan that was popular amongst them in regard to this Oregon dispute called 5440 or fight. This is what your Manifest Destiny advocates would have said. This becomes a big issue around 1845 or so, 1844 for sure. 5440 is a latitude-longitude coordinate. That was the boundary that Americans wanted. That was what they wanted for the boundary of Oregon, 54 degrees 40. So they wanted that to be the boundary between the American part of Oregon and the British part of Oregon. So by saying 5440 or fight, they were saying just what it sounds like. We want 54 degrees 40 or we will fight over it. So threatening war and suggesting war could be an answer with Britain if we didn't get what we wanted. So you can see that aggressiveness and this willing to fight for territory, not just to gain it, but to fight for it if we had to, because of this whole manifest destiny thing. Now, in the end, the United States is going to fight over some territories, but Oregon isn't going to be one of them. So in the end, a compromise is actually going to be reached over the Oregon territory. A compromise line will be agreed to at the 49th parallel, and the 49th parallel instead of 5440. So that's where the boundary is going to be set, as the 49th parallel. The 49th parallel is a little bit lower than 54 degrees 40. In fact, I'll show it to you here in just a second. So that way, the United States was getting some of what it wanted, but backs off a little bit on the 5440 thing and certainly doesn't fight for that. And the reason why a compromise is reached here and that we don't actually end up fighting Britain over it, one, Britain wasn't interested in fighting over it. It's sort of one of those things, yeah, we want more land, but we're not going to go to war with the United States over that. That's silly. And also by this time, when this is agreed to, fighting Britain probably didn't seem like the best idea because by this time the United States was already with war with Mexico over some other territories. So this is agreed to in the midst of the Mexican War, which we're going to be looking at later in this chapter. So that's part of the reason why this is one that we don't actually end up fighting over, and a compromise was reached instead. So if we look at, here's the Oregon Territory that we're talking about. So this is 5440. This is what a lot of Americans wanted. This is the 49th parallel. And the 49th parallel is the modern day boundary between the United States and Canada today. So that's what's eventually agreed to. So this is what we wanted, meaning we would have gotten all of this, but this is what we eventually compromised with. Again, not wanting to go to war with Britain while we're also at war with Mexico. That might not have been a practical thing to do. So later in the last part of this chapter, we'll be looking at that war with Mexico. But first, in the next section, we'll be taking a little trip to Texas, which is going to eventually not only expand the United States, but eventually lead to that conflict with Mexico.